purpose of this video is to introduce you to the basic elements that are supposed to go into a dissertation prospectus so that you can utilize these basic guidelines as you begin to develop your written prospectus. And then from your written prospectus, you can use that information and those elements to prepare your oral presentation that you'll be doing for the on-site. So the objectives for this video are to, first of all, identify the elements of a dissertation prospectus as set forth in the RMU dissertation guidelines, explain the focus of each element to give you an idea of what should be included, describe the areas of emphasis for each element. In other words, these are the things that we're going to be looking for as faculty, and your cohort colleagues will be looking for to decide on the appropriateness of your study, and then talk a little bit about how we take the prospectus and then scaffold that to a dissertation proposal. So I'll be talking about areas that might not be as developed in the prospectus, but then become more developed in the proposal. So what is a prospectus? Well, according to Webster, it's a document that describes the features of a literary work so that prospective participants may evaluate it, so they can tell whether or not it's appropriate or whether or not it has value. And so the RMU definition in the second bullet point is that we're taking a proposal, a dissertation proposal, and abbreviating it so that you can describe your dissertation purpose, your rationale, and plan. And so we do this in an abbreviated way so that your committee, your faculty advisors can evaluate it before you put a lot of work into a proposal. So it allows us to evaluate the basic ideas to whether or not they're appropriate, they're valid, the question is important, has value, before you get too far into a proposal. Because a written proposal could be 60 or 70 pages long, whereas a prospectus is usually less than 10. So this allows us to make changes, make adjustments to things before you get into doing too much work. So it has the value in the sense of a basic evaluation of your ideas. So how do you organize a prospectus? Well, a prospectus should be written in narrative form. I have seen prospectuses in other situations that are designed in kind of a bullet point outline fashion, but we're going to require you to do it in a narrative form so that you can then use that to build your proposal. So you're already writing it in the format that the proposal will be in, so it's just a matter of adding more information as needed to build a prospectus into a proposal. So the prospectus can be generally organized in two ways. And a prospectus usually has two sections, two large sections or chapters, and then multiple subsections. And the first is the introduction, and this is where you give the reader a basic idea of what your research question is, what the rationale is, and give us some specifics as the kinds of research questions you're going to ask. And then the methods is a somewhat general outline. It can be general, it can be specific depending on where you are in the process. That helps us determine and assess whether or not you can answer the question you posed in your introduction. So we want to be able to know that, okay, if this is a good question, do we have the methods in place that can actually answer that question? Do we have the appropriate variables? Is the data feasible to gather to answer that question? And so typically that's how it will be organized. In a traditional dissertation proposal, there's usually a third chapter, and that's the literature review. In a prospectus, you're going to kind of fold the literature review into the introduction, and it's a very abbreviated literature review that will be in an introduction. I'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. But that's generally how we'd like to see you organize it. And again, there's no one specific way to do it, but the elements that we're going to talk about later definitely need to be included. But how you organize that is somewhat up to you, and there is some flexibility there. So what's supposed to go in an introduction? Well, in a classic introduction, whether it's a journal article or whether it's a dissertation or a master's thesis, typically has three main sections. The first is the background and significance section. And so this is where you relay to us why this topic is important, why is it relevant. And so a good way to do this in kind of an opening sentence, kind of an attention-grabbing sentence, will be to quote some statistics that give us some idea of the scope of the problem and why the problem that you're trying to address could be important. So if you're topic area has something to do with childhood obesity, then a great way to relay what your topic is and also express why it's important is to quote some statistics as far as the growth of childhood obesity and perhaps the cost to society of obesity and those sorts of things. So it gets my attention, lets me know what the general topic is, and also starts to give me a sense of why this is important. The next section is to talk about what we know and don't know about the topic. And this is kind of where your literature review gets folded in. So this is going to be a very, very concise, abbreviated literature review. And it's got to be very current and very relevant. So you're going to talk about the literature that is most relevant to your research question and probably the most current relative to your research question. So it's going to be a fairly abbreviated review, and it really does have to be in the context of this is what we know about this topic area, this is what we don't know. And then that leads into what the gaps are. So if you can identify where the gaps are in the literature and why these gaps are important, you can then, again, very concisely talk about how you're going to fill that gap and why that gap needs to be filled. And so that's the first section. Gives us some background, some significance, gives us an idea, educates us on the current state of the literature in this topic area. That leads into the rationale for the study. So why should this study be done? Now, you may have set this up for us by your literature review to say, here's what we know, here's what we don't know. But now you've got to be really specific as to the rationale. It's great to have a gap, but maybe that gap doesn't necessarily need to be filled. So you need to convince us why that gap should be filled. And so a good way to do this is to think about using the questions of who, what, how, and why to relay to us what the rationale is. So who will this benefit? Who will this research benefit? What exactly will be done to create that benefit? Is it an intervention? Is it understanding a relationship between variables? Is it making a prediction of some kind? How will this research benefit these people? And then why will it benefit them? And how could they use this information from your study? What's going to be the application, the practical application, or the theoretical application of this? And so also built into that is this idea of the so what question. And this is a question you'll often hear us ask, and it's not meant to be rude or derogatory to your question, to your research topic, but it's like, so what? Why is this important? What's going to make me think this needs to be done? And so keeping that in the back of your mind as you're writing this will help develop a strong rationale, because we will ask the question, so what? Why this question? And if you can answer that convincingly, then that's what we're looking for as far as your rationale. And then the last section of the introduction is typically a purpose statement. And then with that purpose statement might be some specific aims and then some hypotheses. So for example, a purpose statement might be something like, therefore, the purpose of this study is to identify factors that predict childhood obesity. And then your specific aims might be to develop correlations or a prediction equation that can help us then predict who might become obese as a child and who doesn't, or look at relationships of factors that could be affected that could then prevent someone becoming obese. And then we can have some hypotheses that go along with that. What's important in the introduction is there's good flow. So from the beginning, from that opening attention-grabbing sentence in which maybe you quote some statistics, to the purpose statement, there should be a logical flow. So as I'm reading the introduction, as I'm got my attention, you're giving me some background, you're developing a rationale, by the time I get to the purpose statement, I should say, well, of course, that makes perfect sense why we should be doing this. Why didn't we think of this before? Why haven't we asked this question before? Because you've laid out a perfect story that helps me understand why this question is important and why it can be useful and why it should be answered. And so that's what a good introduction does. It makes it, by the purpose statement, so obvious to me why this should be done that it's kind of a done deal. I won't question it because you've explained it so perfectly that I have no doubt that this is a good research question. And so those are some of the things you need to think about and develop within that introduction. Okay, let's talk about the methods. So in the methods, these are the basic areas that need to be addressed. So you need to talk about the setting in which you're going to conduct your study or gather your data. If you're doing a survey or a mixed methods approach or a qualitative approach, the setting might not be an actual physical location. It might be something you're doing remotely through the internet, through a survey, or using Skype or FaceTime to conduct interviews, or even going to different locations to hand out surveys or conduct interviews. If you're doing more of an interventional study, there will probably be a specific setting that you're going to gather data. And so within that setting, you need to talk about as best you can what resources you'll need, what personnel you might need. It might just be you, or you might have other people involved in the process. So maybe you're doing something related to ACL injuries, and so you need to be referred those ACL injuries from orthopedic surgeons, and so those could be personnel that would be part of your study. So you'll need to think about that and address that as part of the setting. The next is your study subjects. This is the population you're interested in studying. And again, you want to try and define that as best you can at this point. Now, you might have a general idea of what your population is going to be, but you don't have a lot of specifics yet, and that's okay. You may say, I want to study college volleyball players, but you might not know what division yet, and you might not know where you're actually going to get those subjects, but that's the population you want to study. The next thing you want to do is talk about your variables. If you've got an intervention, you're going to have an independent variable. If you're doing more of a qualitative or a mixed methods, you will not have an independent variable necessarily, but you will have dependent variables, outcome variables. And so you want to be able to identify those, and if appropriate at this point, also operationally define them as best you can. If you're doing intervention, you'll need to describe, again, as best you can, what your intervention is going to be, and also what your general procedures are going to be. And again, we don't need to go into excruciating detail yet in this area, but you at least need to give me a general idea of what your procedures are going to be. Who's going to do what, when, where, and again, how. The next element is data collection. How are you going to actually collect your outcome variables, your dependent variables? What method are you going to use? What kinds of safeguards do you have in place relative to ethical conduction of research, relative to what the IRB will expect? So you need to be able to begin to be able to identify some of those things. And again, you might not have that down in super detail yet, but you at least need to be able to express how you might approach these particular elements. And then the last is the data analysis. How are you going to analyze the data? And it's important to remember in a prospectus, in a proposal, that this is how you think you're going to analyze the data. So based upon what you know about your design, your variables, and all these other things, you should have a pretty good idea of how you would probably analyze the data. Now that may change once you have the data actually in your hands, and that's okay. But what we want to do is see how you think you would analyze the data. And so again, as we look at these methods elements, what we're trying to determine is, do these methods match up with your purpose? Do they match up with your rationale? Are they valid, reliable methods? Will these methods help you answer your research question? And do your methods address all your research questions in an appropriate way? So that's the basic evaluation that we'll be doing in methods. Does it make sense? Is it appropriate for the way the kind of question you have? Is it feasible? Very often we see these method sections that students have that are very, very ambitious, that really are not feasible or appropriate for a dissertation. And so those are some of the things, or maybe they're not rigorous enough or detailed enough for us to tell if this is an appropriate method. So those are some of the things that we're going to look for. So some parting thoughts and some points of emphasis in these different sections. At this point in a prospectus, you need to try and make your research question as precise and as clear as you can at this point. If you're still not quite there, that's okay, but try and make it as precise and as clear as you can. Because if it's not clear to us, it's going to stick out. If you're really not sure what direction you want to go with your question, that's going to be fairly obvious. And so we're going to need to work on making that more clear and more precise. In the prospectus, we really emphasize the rationale. This is where we're really, really going to focus, is your rationale. So it needs to be really strong. It needs to be very obvious. You need to basically hit us over the head as to why this study needs to be done. It needs to be extremely obvious. It may be really obvious in your own head, but it might not be obvious to someone who's reading it who maybe doesn't have the same background or the same interests that you do. So you need to make it obvious for them. Now, your literature review is part of the rationale. It needs to be very concise. Your proposal is where you go into excruciating detail and you do a really super comprehensive literature review. In a prospectus, it needs to be very concise, very specific, talking about the studies that are most directly relevant to your question and the most current. So it's going to be maybe just a few paragraphs as opposed to your full-on proposal literature review that's going to be pages and pages. And so keep that in mind. You don't want to go too overboard, but you at least want to be able to present enough evidence that we can make a decision about your rationale. And then lastly, your basic methods and your variable identification need to be appropriate. You might not, again, have all this nailed down yet. You might know what your outcome variable is going to be, but you might not have an operational definition yet. And that's okay. And just be upfront and transparent about that. You might say, I want to measure muscular power, but I haven't quite pinned down exactly what method I'm going to use to do that. I haven't operationally defined muscular power yet, and that's okay. Maybe you're going to do a survey on critical thinking as an outcome, but you haven't identified the appropriate survey yet. And again, that's okay as long as you're transparent about that. Some of your procedures can be somewhat open and somewhat flexible. Again, that's okay too, but do your best to think through what should be there and maybe what areas you still need to fill in. And again, if you're transparent about that, we won't have a problem with it. You can say, this is what I want to do, but I'm not quite sure how I'm going to do it yet. And that's fine. So at this point, what we really want to be able to do is identify, do you have good research questions? Do those need to be worked on? Do you have a strong rationale? Does that need to be worked on? Do you have a basic method that we can say, yes, you can probably answer your question with this method that, again, might need a little bit of work? So if you don't have everything perfectly in place yet, that's fine. That's what the proposal is for, is to get it into kind of that perfect format. And again, as you're developing your written prospectus, you'll be able to pull the information from that and plug it right into your oral presentations you're going to do on site. So hopefully this gave you some things to think about and some things to work from as you start to develop this prospectus. And by all means, ask questions. Talk to your committee if you've got committees. Talk to your CTD if you don't. Dr. Martin and I, if we're not on your committee or not CTDs, would be more than happy to help out as well. So please don't be afraid to ask questions. This is meant to be a learning process right now. It's not. We don't expect it to be perfect, but we expect you to kind of put the effort in to make it a workable product. So thanks for listening. And again, if you've got any questions, just let us know.